Hello and welcome back to Untold Wealth. I'm one of your hosts, Vince,
And I'm Devon.
and we're happy to have you back on this episode of Untold Wealth. It's going to be a good one. We're covering the greatest, most epic economic debates of past, present, potentially future. I don't know what Devon has chosen, because how this show works is we are both given a topic line that either Devon and I have written down in a shared doc, and then we do our own little research, find what interests us about the topic, and then basically present it to each other. And today, I'm quite excited about mine. And from what it sounds like, you are too.
I am. I am very excited. But it is economic battles of history. Okay.
Okay, okay.
I need that reach because my topic is so left field. I need that broader kind of title such that my actual content can encompass it. So
I see. Well, that
yeah, yeah, yeah.
makes me all the more interested because I've, in my brain at least, I chose a battle in the form of a debate. But even then, I think what I've chosen is a debate or a battle in a loose sense of the word, as you'll soon see. But yeah, episode, what is it, 7 now? Uh, I've been
Yeah,
really
I think
enjoying
it
this.
is. Yeah, I mean, this has been a journey for us. It's going well. We're really enjoying it, and we're getting better and better. And it's becoming more and more fun. I think it feels good. Feels
Yeah,
good, man.
I was listening to my audio from episode 1, and compared to what it is in episode like 6 or 7 of this episode, it's starkly different, which I'm
Mm.
glad to have. But nevertheless, I'll be starting us off this episode. And throughout my research, there was a lot of great debates that economists have had throughout history. As you can imagine, economists don't really agree with each other on a lot of topics, especially if the matter at hand is like theoretical and can be spun in many different ways.
And
But
I think we also chatted about it, or you briefly touched on it in one of your content pieces in a previous episode.
yes,
Um, mm,
the economic theories, and that really goes to show like how, I guess from a macro perspective, how different things could be viewed. But what I'm going to be chatting about today is a little bit different from that. It was in a sphere of real world economic practices, economic decisions that would affect people's livelihood, etc., for decades to come, and would birth kind of prominent monetary policies that we have today. Today, I'm going to be talking about the great bullionist debates, or the great bullionist controversy.
yeah, yeah, I've totally heard of that.
Well, I was going to ask, it sounds like you haven't heard of that, which also means that your topic is not, which I'm
It
happy.
is it is not that. It's not even in the same realm.
Okay,
so
okay.
so I'm all ears. Just repeat it one more time.
So,
Bullionist debates?
the great bullionist controversy or the great bullionist debates.
Mm.
And bullion is kind of a term which I think as I go on, you'll be more familiar with because it has to do with gold standards and monetary policy, things like that.
That okay, that kind of spelling. Gotcha.
But to set the scene here, we're talking about a period of time that spanned from about 1797 to the early 1820s, a good chunk of decades. And for a bit more context here, the time period at the time was fairly rife with conflict. The Napoleonic Wars were at the forefront of the minds of the British population, as Napoleon had been gathering his forces and amassing power and striking fear into British people. Fears that he would conquer England or at least disturb the British economy. This led to a bit of a panic and an all too common phenomenon, a bank run. So, a bank run, for those who are unfamiliar with the term, is when a large number of people basically get scared by something and then run to their bank and begin to make big withdrawals at the same time. This could be either the bank failing, society collapsing, or etc., etc. And in this case, people were going to these banks and trading their British pounds for the equivalent in gold. Something David and I have talked about in the very first episode of this show.
Very familiar.
But as is the issue with bank loans, when people rush to the banks and demand withdrawals, all at the same time, banks can't handle it. They're not liquid enough. They don't have the cash on hand, essentially, to allow customers to withdraw. And in this case, exchange their British pounds for gold all at once. So, in response to this, the British government suspends SEPI payments. They essentially stop people from being able to trade their money for gold. And so, for what I think it was the first time, the British pound becomes a fiat currency, paper currency that is not tied to anything. A Wild West scenario for Britain.
That's interesting. So they did it temporarily. So they were like, hey, just for now, no gold trading? Okay, gotcha. So it's like temporary fiat currency.
Exactly. I think this might not be the first time this has happened. I think in cases of like wartime scenarios, like there was just kind of the suspension to stop this, I suppose, or essentially curb the situation. But in this particular scenario, there were economists on hand who began to have many strong opinions about what this move would cause the economy to become, which spurred the great bullionist debates. All right. So now that the context has been set, this kind of became a controversial thing. The debate kind of comprised of two main distinctive sides: the bullionists, who wanted to return to the gold bullion equivalent or the convertibility, and the anti-bullionists, who were kind of happy to stay on fiat currency. And here's kind of a
just quick question: was it like strict fiat currency? Because there's a distinction between, I suppose, you can go to a bank and get your gold, to a currency still being backed by gold. Because if a currency is still backed by gold, I don't know if it is considered fiat currency. I'm honestly just not too sure. Do you know if it was still backed by gold, or they just said you can't withdraw gold? Like it was still enshrined that it was backed by gold, and what would be the British Fort Knox, I suppose.
For this period of time, it was not backed by gold. You couldn't exchange it, but it also not backed. Like you'll see, the supply of money begins to change drastically, and is untethered by gold. So maybe fiat currency wasn't the right term for it.
But like it was just about though. I'm just like semantically, I'm just not too sure what the distinction is. Like even myself.
Right, I see. Well, if someone smarter than us could drop it in the comments, we'd be very appreciative. But nevertheless, the bullionists thought that the suspension of this convertibility would basically lead to a terrible situation. They were partly right. The Bank of England began printing money, and the supply of money drastically increased, which led to widespread inflation and a worsening exchange rate. And so the bullionists claimed that this overissuing of these untethered notes were leading to these economic conditions. People like Walter Boyd and Henry Parnell wrote pamphlets, which, as a side note, I didn't know this, but apparently, like, instead of writing books and like journals, people would just economists would write pamphlets and then issue those out to the world, which for whatever reason is just a cool thought.
I'm just picturing them inscribing a few graphs and stuff on pamphlets and then
exactly.
handing them out at the nearest grocer or merchant.
You have a paper boy shouting
this is why I'm right. Take my pamphlet. Join my cult.
I mean, it could have been. That's what pamphlets stirred in me as well, to be honest. But yeah, they wrote these pamphlets critiquing this move. And quite interestingly, they began to essentially put the quantitative theory of money into kind of a real term practice. The quantity theory of money, for those who don't, is essentially the theory that the amount of money in an economy has an impact on the level of economic activity. Today, this is kind of neatly put together in the Fisher equation, which is MV equal to PT. So that's the money supply times the velocity of
money, yeah.
is equal to the average price level times the volume of transactions. So they basically said, since the money supply was increasing, that would basically mean that the average price level would also increase. Going over, yeah.
No, I was just thinking, like, for those of you, how I like to think of that is basically inflation, right? Price level increases your basket of goods that you would generally use to measure inflation. That's going to increase. Basically, it's too much money chasing too few goods. So the money's relative value decreases
Exactly.
when compared to those goods. So that's how you just think too much money chasing too few goods.
Yeah.
Money doesn't mean much if everyone's got a lot. Syndrome style from The Incredibles.
Exactly. And like this kind of monetary policy or monetary theory of thinking had been kind of speculated, but not put as neatly as this. This was kind of on the fringe of that development. But going over to the anti-bullionists side, these guys basically were taking the position to exonerate the Bank of England. They were trying to draw attention away from the fact that this was the bank's fault, that them printing money was not the real cause of this inflation and worsening exchange rate. One video that I saw discussing this topic basically called these guys like bank apologists rather than economists, because they blamed the increase in prices and everything else on other factors, things like particularly bad harvests during this kind of time period, which would, to be fair, also impact the economy in this way. But unfortunately, I think these guys in particular took too big of a, they died on this hill and were on the wrong side of history.
It sounds like they were trying to say how that is bad instead of saying why fiat money is good, right? Like they were like, no, this is bad. Like let's just focus on why it's bad. Like
Kind of, yeah, because with this new non-backed currency, the money supply increased, and yeah, since it wasn't like backed by anything, they didn't have to like essentially. It was a lot less strict, and so these guys were, as you said, pushing this blame onto something else. But also within these anti-bullionists, there was the idea of what we now today know as the real bills doctrine, which basically said that like to fight inflation and stimulate the economy, banks could issue short-term loans that then people would spend quickly to produce goods and then repay that loan back to the bank, which would stimulate the economy but not really increase the money supply. So, in essence, these two sides fought for a while. In I think 1904 or so, a new major player enters the game. Henry Thornton, who does the equivalent of like dropping a hot new rap album. And he releases a work called An Enquiry into the Nature and Effects of the Paper Credit of Great Britain. And he basically summarizes and takes both sides into account and essentially synthesizes.
There we go.
These two sides and proposes that the quantity of money does matter. Changing the supply of money without other policies in place is a bad idea. But he also took into account the fact that like other external effects could have had a change or heightened the decrease in the economy during this time. He was kind of revolutionary. He had a very modern way of thinking about monetary policy. He gave advice such as like the banks should be more liquid and facilitate more money, even if it costs like loans being taken by the bank. to give out to people if bank runs do occur. And he also encouraged management between banks, discretionary management that would help situations like deflation, which we saw later. But I think another major issue to kind of put into the context of this time is that these economists brought up these major points of monetary policy and monetary theory, really, without a lot of information. Like, they didn't have the indices that we have today. They were just working off like wheat prices and exchange rates and things like that. So it was really impressive that these guys were like building up this modern monetary theory just basically with scraps and bits of information.
I think when you're in a fight, you just knuckle down and you go at it, right? And they just they came up with some gold, right? Because they kind of hit the head on pretty much a lot of mainline theory.
Absolutely. And in 1810, Francis Horner, Henry Thornton, and a few others basically released the sequel to this excellent album in a government-funded report called the Bullion Report, which basically solidifies their own argument and the Bullionist side of thinking by essentially providing defects of the information that they didn't have previously, that monetary policies made by the Bank of England was the cause of the inflation. And once again, a very modern view on the time. And for the rest of the time, people like David Ricardo, Thomas Malthus, and others basically just dunk on the anti-Bullionist view until the Bank of England reinstates convertibility in 1821.
Even Malthus chimed in, eh?
Yeah.
Infamous.
You start like hearing about these like famous names in economics, and the latter half of this great Bullionist debate just basically ended up being kind of a slaughter for the anti-Bullionists.
Didn't sound like they had much to work with, like.
But to me, it's kind of crazy that this is from 1797 to 1821. So for like nearly 30 years, the pound wasn't backed by gold. And from what I saw, like there was this large inflationary period because of this, as they kind of pumped out the money. And then there was a period of deflation, so much so that the fact that when they reinstated that the British pound could be like converted for gold, the rate at which it could be converted, which you might expect to be a lot higher because of inflation, actually turned out to be not that much higher because of the deflation. So
that did just confuse my head. I gotta be honest.
No problem.
Just repeat that one more time.
So essentially, there was a period of large inflation when gold was no longer backing the British pound. But then following that, there was a period of deflation to the point where when they reinstated that ability to convert your pound for gold, the conversion rate, which you might expect to be higher because of inflation. So if you were getting like a pound of gold for $1, you might be getting like half a pound. It was more closer to the original value than expected because of this period of deflation.
Because it was such a harsh drop. Like, because, I mean, you said it was like 30, 20 years? So there was like some, I wouldn't say rapid inflation, but steady inflation. But you said that deflationary period was like short and swift and very steep. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Essentially, yeah. So the kind of end result was like they went back to the gold standard, and the inflation that they experienced between these two periods of time in the aggregate wasn't that much.
Leveled out,
and the other thing that was born from it was this very awesome and like experienced monetary policy, which we still use today. So overall, looking at this debate, it was a major win, I think, overall.
But the Bullionists didn't get it in the end, dude. Fiat currency reigned supreme in the end.
Yeah, I suppose so.
But for their time, they had good points. We'll give it.
Exactly. And I think my like main takeaway from like looking at all of this was the fact that I was quite surprised that a lot of these, uh, not ancient, but older economic thinkers were like so on the money with economic policies that we still consider to be like valid with a lot more evidence behind it.
Mm.
And just an overall fact of like, man, these guys were smart, dude. Even if they were just like yelling their pamphlets on the street corner and stuff.
We also did touch on that kind of thinking in episode 4. It's
Oh.
math related to economics, like these people were coming up with good ideas when they didn't have advanced mathematical computational analysis at their disposal, and even when they did, there was an argument that it wasn't necessary or that it was. But I mean, give episode 4 a re-listen, guys, and tell us what you think.
I like
All
that.
right, so that was the Booleanist debate, the great Booleanist debate.
Yeah.
Very nice, Vince.
I
I
think
enjoyed that,
debates
man.
kind of has a quotation mark around it, but nevertheless, yeah, it still counts as far as I'm concerned about this
Cool,
topic.
cool. But round of applause. I was going to do something similar. I was going to look for points in time where economists were at each other's throats.
Hmm.
We've chatted about it before, and obviously you brought another one up. But I found an interesting story, right? Because I was trying to figure out when people got shafted by the economy. Kind of like they're battling the economy
Okay,
instead
okay.
of instead of them battling each other. But I
I feel like
found,
this
yeah,
is a running theme for you because in the very first episode, you also spoke about like how the people got shafted by the American government when they went off the court stand.
yeah.
Well, you're a real man of the people, is what I'm getting at
Yeah,
here.
of course, I'm a champion of the people. But if I'm a champion of the people, the person I'm about to speak about is the king. All right, and not because he was intelligent, not because he was esteemed in any way, or had insight that others did not, but because he's possibly one of the luckiest individuals that I've ever read about. And if you've heard of this individual, you'll be like, cool, this is a lovely story. I want to hear this again. If you haven't heard of this individual, your mind will be blown because he won the economic battle for
No,
at least for his own economic freedom in this world, but in the most obtuse ways. Um, Without further ado, I'm going to be talking about a man by the name of Timothy Dexter. Uh, does that ring any bells, Stevens?
it doesn't. There's like
I'm I'm thrilled. I'm so glad it doesn't. Okay, let's talk about Tim. All
sure.
right,
I'm hooked.
a gentleman born in 1747 in Malden, Massachusetts. All right, uh, yeah, fairly impoverished lifestyle. Became a farmhand at 8. Worked in a tannery until he was about 18. Started his own business from his 20 onwards. He was never the brightest kid, but he worked hard. Um, but in his tannery escapades and working with leather, one of his, I wouldn't say colleagues, but maybe rivals, um, died, and he actually married
Oh
the
no.
widow, one Elizabeth Frothingham, a very rich widow, and with that money he bought a mansion. Okay, so Tim kind of has this obsession throughout his life that he is an upperclassman, and he wants people to know it. He wants to mingle with upperclassmen, but records show that he was nowhere close to being an esteemed gentleman. He was quite
Okay.
flamboyant, and quite rude at times even. But like he wanted to be in that crowd, so he ended up doing what the crowd did, and much, much to his success. Or he actually did what the crowd didn't, much to his success. But we'll get to that later. So, okay, this was in 1769 that he married. And this was also around the same time that the American Revolutionary War was taking place. This was
Wait,
between. Yeah.
Did you say 1917-69?
Sorry, maybe I cut out 1769. Sorry,
Okay,
sorry, sorry.
okay.
Okay, cool, cool. Glad we're on the same page. So yeah, it was a while ago. But yes, the American Revolutionary War, obviously between the United States and a few other nations in the world, and obviously the UK, England. Um, and at this time during the Revolutionary War, in fact, before the Revolutionary War started, um, these continents printed a currency named the Continental currency. All right,
Oh,
and this could be exchanged for any of the currencies within this, these continent nations that were kind of standing up against the UK.
what
A
a
good
novel
idea,
idea.
and a good idea in practice, right? But very quickly, this currency suffered the same woes that you were describing earlier. Uh, Printed too much of it. Soldiers were getting paid with it, but why wouldn't they just want to have, you know,
Real
British
money.
pounds, dollars? Um, and eventually, the value of the continental currency dipped to all-time lows. It wasn't even worth pennies. Okay, but all these veterans who had come home from the Revolutionary War had their like stipends and paychecks in continental currency, right?
That's
There was
rough.
there was actually a phrase. I think it's like, I might be butchering the phrase, but it was something along the lines of not even worth a continental. At that time, it was seen as such a terrible currency to have. They made an idiom about it, to be honest. But all right, so there was a big problem in the Americas. People had these, and they were worth nothing. So Timothy Dexter obviously had this nice mansion that he got because of his widow's money, his new
Yeah.
wife's money. His neighbors were saying, "Oh, chaps, I'll buy your continental currency. Just give it to me. I'll give you a few pennies. Let's make sure you get a living. You came back from the war. We'll do it." And they obviously bought a little bit of it. Timothy wanted to go even further. Ah, my neighbors are doing it. I want to be in that class. I will buy hundreds and hundreds of times more than what they are buying. In fact, he actually essentially bankrupted himself
Oh my God.
in
Yeah.
buying all of these continental currency stipends. Um, and it was a terrible call. You can ask anyone. That is the wrong thing to do. But what ended up happening is that the American Constitution got ratified. And there was a
Okay, okay.
provision that said that you could then sell your your continental currency for a bond that's bond that has the value of 1% of its face value. I think, which
Okay,
wasn't
okay.
wasn't a terrific deal, but it
No.
was hundreds of times more than what these things were worth. And and Timothy had a mountain of it. So he became very rich very, very quickly. But he didn't stop there. So that is his first lucky escapade. Um, but at this
But
point, yeah.
before you continue, do you know what like I was thinking while you were like chatting about this? History kind of repeats itself in most cases, right? You know? And I was thinking this kind of reminds me of like the crypto niche a little bit. How like cryptocurrencies are, why wouldn't you just want real money? And
Mm.
how it's just trashed down. And maybe we should edit this out, Devon. But what if we just bought all the cryptocurrencies at its lows right now? And what if the government changed its constitution to be like, here, take these bonds instead?
The boldest investment strategy, banking on a constitutional amendment to justify your investment. Oh man,
Like, it's not
Timothy.
financial advice, just by the way.
Yeah, yeah, no, Timothy really changed the game. But yeah, we don't recommend you do that, our loving listeners. but but okay, before I get to some lucky things he did, to show you
Mm.
how weird this person was, and I mean it in the most kind way, he was kind of harrowing his local government to give him a position, you know, some kind of position in politics. And eventually they gave in and they bestowed upon him the position of official informer of deer. Okay, and that is DEER. like the
Yeah, I was
deers
going
that
to
roam in the
ask.
forest, despite the fact that there were no deer in Malden. So his entire position was the informer of deer. They gave it to him, knowing full well there were no deer in the state or
They
anywhere around, but they made him the informer of deer. So
they
they
definitely
really,
made that up just to appease this rich
they
asshole.
absolutely did. They did. They made it up to get him him off their asses, essentially.
Oh
But yeah, that
god.
was just a little snippet. There's a few other weird snippets, but okay. Other than that, uh, these rich people, his rich neighbors, were kind of jealous of his success, and they kind of plotted for his downfall because he was a bit of a tool. Um, and every time they said something, and this is the common theme, he did it, and they were saying bad ideas. One of the ideas was they advised him to send bed warmers to the West Indies, obviously one of the hottest climates out there, very near the equator.
Yeah.
Um,
We covered that last episode actually about with
yes, yeah,
ice.
yes, exactly. And he did it. And can you believe it? Bed warmers, if you don't know, they're kind of like these big spoons with a pot on the top, closes it out, and you can put it on your bed to keep you warm during winter. He managed to sell it to the West Indies, but not for bed warming purposes, because the molasses industry in the West Indies had taken off, and they used it as ladles. They used it as big spoons. So,
Oh god.
so he actually sold that at a hefty profit. All right. Another piece of advice they gave him was to ship coal to Newcastle. Um, and this one, they were very much making fun of him because Newcastle was the foremost producer of coal in all the
I
British
see.
colonies. So they were like taking a dig at him. He still did it. And by the time his barge arrived with his shipment of coal, can you believe it? All the miners in Newcastle were on strike. So they were suffering a
You're kidding.
I'm not. They were suffering a major coal shortage. Um,
This guy can't miss.
that went terrifically well. They tried to convince him to sell gloves to the Portuguese. Obviously, the Portuguese don't get the terribly cold weather. They didn't need the
Mm.
gloves. But there was a giant expedition heading to the Arctic, and they
Hmm.
needed some lovely gloves. So things like this just kept happening. He sold cats to the Caribbean. This is actually a famous story. The Caribbean had a terrible rat infestation. He didn't even know about it. He just was trying to
He
sell
just sold
cats,
cats.
and he sold cats to the Caribbean, and it worked out like it just worked out. He also, this is weird as well. He hoarded whale bones. Okay, why does that matter? You ask. Because whale bones are used in fashion. Typically, the corsets for ladies were kind of reinforced with
Right.
with whale bones. All right, but as soon as he hoards the male bones, whale bones, the
That
male
just gender doesn't matter, yeah.
yeah, the male fashion industry also took a turn for the better for the corset industry, and it became like a fad for them to have like their own like whalebone structured suits and like these kind of corset looking things. They have a name for it, I forget. But that went like swimmingly well. So everything this guy
Incredible.
touched turned to like economic gold for some reason. It turned to financial well being for him, his family, for everyone involved. Um,
Man.
and it's yeah, corset stays. There we go, corset stays, and everything he did. I think I'm even missing one. There's even another ridiculous one I can't remember. But at this point, his colleague, I mean, I wouldn't say his colleagues, but his rivals were just, I mean, what could you do? There's nothing you could do. Um, and
What period
eventually,
of time was this exactly?
it's early
Like, how many years?
1800s. Yeah. Oh, of all that, he lived to 64, I think. Um, so if he is 1769, 1820, so he was in his 30s to 40s. I would say it was a 20
Amazing.
year 20 years he did all of these astounding feats. So I think that's a fair assumption. Um, but yeah, eventually Timothy was surrounded by people who wanted to, you know, vie for his affection. He had two kids. He had his wife, obviously, but he wanted to figure out who was closest to him, and he faked his death.
Oh,
He faked his
okay.
death. He held a mock wake for himself. Okay, and when spying at his funeral to see if people were, sullen or crying. He spotted his wife was not crying. So when the funeral's over, he confronted her in the kitchen and started wailing at her with his cane. And then the whole procession kind of like, God, I don't know if procession's the right word, but the people came in and they saw him still alive and well, beating his wife with a cane. Just the most peculiar man on earth. Not smart by any means. In fact, he was illiterate. Okay, this is the wildest one. This is the one I forgot. He was
I,
illiterate, but fashion, spoke of himself as the greatest philosopher of our times, and he wrote a book. All right, can you guess the name of the book?
I,
Okay, you're not gonna guess the name for the
no,
book. I
I'm
shouldn't
not
have
gonna.
asked.
Moby Dick. I don't
It's
know.
it's called A Pickle for the Knowing Ones. It was a memoir of his life. It was some rhetoric. It was, a commentary on society and politics. Um, the book contained 8,800 words, okay? But
Hmm.
no punctuation, capitalization, and a myriad of spelling errors. The wildest part is that the first edition, self-published, sold out. The second edition sold out as well. And the second edition had an additional 11 pages. And those 11 pages were just a whole hell of a lot of full stops, commas, punctuation marks of any kind. He said, because his argument was essentially like, you guys wanted these so much, here you are. The printers can distribute them in the book if they want. Um, and and his book was wildly successful as well. Um, so
Incredible.
so this is truly a man who really the luckiest man on earth, but essentially won the economy. I don't know how to say it better. He won the global economy. He traded with anyone and their mom, and it still worked out. And who can be luckier than that? I read this. I was dumbfounded. It makes no
No,
sense.
I'm dumbfounded. Like this guy, over that span of time that you mentioned, like this is abnormally. I, I can't fathom. Like this guy, just the stroke, like the next couple of years, if you consider like the karmic scales of this guy, how much luck he's drawn upon, were like miserable to balance things out.
Yeah, there were a few people that, yeah, that got it quite rough. If he got all the good karma, for
I,
sure.
really, I'm most impressed that like having like worked in the factory, that he just married like a rich widow at the very start. Like
I
that's
He must have had some odd charm to him. I mean, there's no
hmm.
other way of explaining it, right? Even depictions of him, it shows he looks like a clown, to be honest. Um, he looks a bit like a clown. Like he's got this absurd headdress. He's walking around with a dog in his cane, and he looks like a jester. Um, he even hired a poet to walk around. This guy wasn't a poet. He was pretty much a guy who sold fish at the at the marketplace. But here's one of the poems he made. Lord Dexter's a man of fame. Most celebrated is his name. More precious far than gold that's pure. Lord Dexter shine forevermore. And like he just surrounded himself with,
Beautiful.
he kind of willed his existence into this world, and it's impressive. It's
Yeah,
impressive, shocking, but hey,
I wonder if this
well
guy
done to
like
him.
if he practiced affirmations and went to bed
Yeah,
manifesting
yeah, yeah.
stuff like that.
Just like visualizing the next day, like concretely, like trying to figure out what's gonna happen. Just like wakes up,
That's
has a dream about whale bones, and says, that's it. That
I'll take it all.
I'll take everything. I'll take everything. But
That's
yeah,
incredible.
it's very off topic. I'm so glad you enjoyed it, but I do realize it's a bit of a stretch for greatest economic battles of history. Um, because I just chatted about someone who won. He really did. Um,
Yeah, I think this is a good like example of the fact that it's like sometimes the economy is just a game that doesn't have any rules.
oh, really? Is it?
Yeah, you can be very inexperienced, but sometimes you just you flip the coin and it lands heads like 7,000 times statistically, and you just win. Uh, so I'm not too surprised, but I'm just in sheer awe of the examples of how he came to his success. Like those were incredible.
Which
You could
which
spin
one
it.
which one was the craziest one? I know you might not be able to remember them all. I think the craziest one has to be the coal. I mean,
No, the coal is very, very like the
that's
timing of that one
ridiculous.
specifically. Because, for the other ones, you could maybe argue, like, oh, he might have, like, big
But
brained it a little bit.
you
But
could make a case for the Cats to the Caribbean to be just as absurd.
yeah, I was going to say that one was probably my favorite just because of, like, the like, origin. Because everything else was just, like, goods and products and stuff. But he thought, like, yeah, the Caribbean, they need more cats there. So I'm just going to take a boatload of cats to
Yeah,
the Caribbean.
I couldn't find out what the genesis for that idea was. If it was an idea, if you just passed by the Caribbean with a fleet of cats and it just worked out, like I actually couldn't find that out. But all you know is that it wouldn't have mattered. He would have done it anyway. Um, like it would have happened. Fate smiled upon Timothy. Um, and
If I can find his book online and just do a little peruse. If I can,
please,
I'll drop it in the description of this episode because I think
please do.
people would enjoy that.
And speaking of which, this episode, ladies and gents, that was episode 7 of Untold Wealth. It was honestly a joy to chat with Vince about the economic battles of history. And yeah, if you guys have any, other suggestions for episodes, or if you can note any other great economic battles of history that you guys want us to chat about, or that you just want us to know about, please drop a comment down below, and please make sure to rate this episode either a thumbs up on YouTube or perhaps a 5-star on Spotify. We'd really appreciate it. But without further ado, thank you very much for having us and for listening. My name's Devon, and this is my colleague.
Vince Belloc.
And this was Untold Wealth, episode 7. We will see you next time. See ya.
So yeah.